The worst accidents in war. So, we've all had bad days where things just don't go right. Well, the military's no different, but the stakes can be even higher. For those in uniform, the enemy isn't the only thing to worry about. Dangers can be unintentional, whether it's from your fellow soldiers, faulty equipment, or just being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Here are just some examples of the worst unintended disasters in the military. The sinking of the USS Thresher. When it was first commissioned in the early 1960s, SSN 593, the USS Thresher, was one of the newest and most advanced submarines in the US Navy, fitted with the latest in sonar, weapons, and communication gear available. Less than 2 years after its launch, it would find a permanent home on the bottom of the ocean. After its launch in 1961, the Thresher was subject to numerous sea trials designed to iron out any issues that may be found in the new craft. Some issues included problems with the diesel engine, as well as problems restarting the nuclear reactor, though these were quickly repaired and were not considered serious problems, though they did require attention. On April 9, 1963, after a 9-month refit, the Thresher, along with 129 crewmen, were underway on exercises to conduct dive tests. They were joined by the USS Skylark, a specialized submarine recovery ship. Tests began around 220 miles off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. After several shallow dives to test communication equipment, the Thresher began its descent to its test depth, around 1,300 feet. The sub descended, keeping in contact with the Skylark, giving a routine check-in at 9:12 a.m. A few minutes later, the exact time was unrecorded, the Skylark received a message stating, "Minor difficulties, positive up angle, attempting to blow," a probable reference to the ballast tanks. At 9:17 a.m., the Skylark received another message, too garbled to understand, though the number 900 was mentioned. Some technicians on the Skylark remember hearing what sounded like air rushing, then silence. A search operation was ordered. In hours, 15 ships were searching for the Thresher. After a day of futile efforts, any optimism gave way to the reality that the Thresher was lost with all hands. John F. Kennedy ordered flags flown at half-staff in honor of those lost. 14 months later, the ship was found, broken in several pieces on the ocean floor, 8,400 feet below the surface. An inquiry was held to determine what happened. Given the circumstances, it's impossible to say, though it was generally believed that a piping failure led to flooding in the engine compartment, which shorted out the electrical system, making propulsion and therefore surfacing impossible. The ship drifted downwards until water pressure was too great, and the hull collapsed under the strain. There are some that challenge this theory, however. The message relayed indicated a so-called minor problem, and a leaking pipe at that depth was anything but minor. It is possible that an issue with the propulsion system was the problem, and when the captain ordered the ballast tanks to be blown to help surface the sub, it was already too deep, and they failed to operate. The Thresher descended until it reached collapse depth. No matter the cause, the loss of the Thresher was the first sinking of a nuclear submarine and led to a major overhaul in how subs would be designed, with more oversight to their construction and operation. To this day, like all lost subs, the Navy doesn't list the Thresher as lost, but on eternal patrol. Operation Cobra. After gaining a foothold after the invasion of Normandy, the Western Allies became bogged down. The Germans were heavily entrenched and were fighting fiercely and were aided by the terrain. Standing in the way of the Allied advance were a tangled maze of hedgerows. These were long rows of dense shrubbery planted by farmers as boundaries, thick enough to stop a tank in its tracks and provide concealment for hidden machine gun nests and other fighting positions. The U.S. First Army had advanced as far as the town of St. Lo when a counterattack by German panzers brought them to a standstill. In order to break out, General Umar Bradley made use of the Allies' near total air superiority. Named Operation Cobra, the plan was for a large number of aircraft, some 2,500 in number, along with concentrated artillery barrages, to pummel German positions with high volumes of ordnance. Some of the aircraft in the operation would be small fighter bombers, such as the P-47 Thunderbolt, but a large number would be made of much bigger aircraft, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 is a high-altitude strategic bomber, better suited for destroying factory complexes and other large targets, rather than as a means of close air support against troops on the ground. Precision was of tantamount importance, as the American soldiers would be stationed nearby. To mark the area, colored smoke would be deployed at the four corners of the area occupied by the Americans. The plan was originally scheduled for July 24th, though due to inclement weather was delayed until the next day. Though the weather did clear enough for the operation to commence, there were some low-hanging clouds and the wind blew the colored smoke, obstructing the bombers' view of their target. Furthermore, the planes were supposed to approach parallel to the front line, so even if they dropped their payload too soon or overshot their target, it would land harmlessly rather than on American positions. Instead, they flew perpendicular, directly overhead of American lines. The bulk of the bombs and artillery drop did land on the German panzers, who bore the brunt of the bombardment. Some bombers, however, dropped too soon, and their bombs plummeted right on top of American lines. In the words of correspondent Ernie Pyle, quote, "We were horrified by the suspicion that those machines, high in the sky and completely detached from us, were aiming their bombs at the smoke line on the ground, and a gentle breeze was drifting the smoke line back over us." End quote. During the course of the incident, 111 Americans would be killed and about 500 wounded. Among the dead was General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American to be killed in the European theater. In spite of the tragedy, the Germans were badly crippled by the operation, and the Allies were able to break through their lines, ending the stalemate at Normandy. Desert 1. In 1979, during the chaos of the Iranian Revolution, the American embassy in Tehran was seized by revolutionaries, taking 66 hostages. Some would be released, but by April 1980, 53 hostages remained. President Jimmy Carter tried to secure the hostages release through diplomatic means, but it became increasingly clear that a more forceful method would be needed. Named Operation Eagle Claw, the task would be an arduous one. Tehran is isolated by 700 miles of desert, which would have to be traversed undetected. The operatives would have to land at the embassy, rescue the hostages, and evacuate from a hostile city of 4 million people. Planning and executing for this operation fell on Delta Force, who immediately began planning the op. Several possibilities were considered, and after deliberation it was determined that the primary mode of transport would be Navy RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters, aircraft known for their long range and large capacity. The next challenge would be refueling the helicopters, since they wouldn't be able to make the entire round-trip journey on their fuel capacity. To facilitate this, a landing zone in the Iranian desert about 200 miles southeast from Tehran was selected as a refueling site. Lockheed EC-130 transports would carry external fuel bladders to refill the helicopters before they made their way to the objective. The entire mission would be protected by Air Force AC-130H gunships. Problems began almost immediately. The helicopters were provided by the Navy with naval aviators, though it was determined that Marine Corps co-pilots would accompany them, since they had more experience on long-range land assault missions. Many of the naval personnel would be replaced when the challenges of flying at low altitude over land proved difficult for them to master. When the mission launched, 12 pilots were from the Marine Corps, 3 from the Navy, and 1 from the Air Force, each with different levels of experience with this type of operation. Compounding the difficulties in coordination was the disjointed training the men underwent. Delta operatives trained for their role in North Carolina, helicopter crews in Arizona, and Air Force crews in Florida or Guam, with additional troops training at bases in Europe. In short, Army, Navy, Marine, and Air Force personnel, each with differing levels of experience and doctrine, were practicing for a mission separately from one another, not building the trust and coordination necessary for such a complex operation of this sort. The planned operation was complex, the 8 Sea Stallions taking off from the USS Nimitz, flying to the refueling station at Desert 1, then would proceed to a hideout location south of Tehran. The rescue team would travel overland using vehicles obtained by agents in the country, then proceed to the embassy and foreign ministry and rescue the hostages. Once secure, the helicopters would fly in, pick up the hostages and rescuers, and fly to an abandoned airbase near Tehran, which would be secured by Army Rangers. The helicopters would be destroyed, and all would board waiting C-141 transports to an airbase in Egypt. With such a complex operation, breakdowns were inevitable. On April 24, 1980, the operation commenced. Problems occurred almost immediately. One helicopter fell out due to a mechanical failure. Another turned back after being lost in a dust storm. The 6 remaining helicopters made it to Desert 1 and began refueling. Another helicopter suffered an issue with its hydraulic system, leaving only 5 Stallions to complete the mission, too few for any chance of success. The mission was scrubbed and preparations were made to return home. In the confusion of darkness and a dust storm, exacerbated by the rotor blades, a Stallion and taxiing C-130 collided, the blades of the helicopter slicing through the fuselage. A giant fireball ripped through both craft. 8 men were killed in the explosion, and a number were badly burned. With the mission in shambles, the survivors boarded the remaining C-130s for evacuation. The tragedy at Desert 1 has been attributed to the complex nature of the plan, the ad hoc organization of the forces involved, and the need for secrecy which made coordination between the different branches of service difficult. So, the military has an unofficial rule, KISS, which means keep it simple, stupid. The more complex the plan, the more likely it's going to be to fall apart. With so many moving parts in this operation, it was almost inevitable that something would go wrong. The Sultana Incident. In April 1865, the long and bloody American Civil War finally came to a close. Thousands of Union captives who had spent years in captivity at infamous prisons in the Deep South, such as Andersonville, were finally released. In order to help bring them home, the U.S. government commissioned steamships as transport. One such vessel was the Sultana, a side-paddled wooden steamboat designed for transporting cotton along the Mississippi River. Lured by the bounty for transporting former POWs, $5 for enlisted, $10 for officers, Captain James Mason arrived at Vicksburg. In order to save time and money, a broken steam boiler was hastily patched rather than replaced, a major safety violation. This was only the beginning of the malfeasance that would end in tragedy. In an effort to maximize profits, Captain Mason worked out a deal with Union authorities to cram as many ex-POWs on the ship as possible and offered hefty bribes to do so. As a result of this blatant corruption, 1,960 prisoners, 22 Union soldiers, 70 paying passengers, and 85 crew members were crowded on board the Sultana. According to federal regulations, the maximum capacity on board the ship was 376, though these were frequently ignored by steamship operators. Departing from Vicksburg on April 24th, the steamer headed north. Passage up the Mississippi was difficult as winter snows were melting, causing flooding and unpredictable currents. In addition to this, debris would frequently obstruct passage of the steamer on its journey. On April 26, the Sultana arrived in Memphis for a brief stop before once again heading north. On April 27th at around 2 a.m., disaster struck. The boilers, straining against the swift current, became overheated, and one exploded under the increased pressure. Many men packed into the boiler room were killed instantly by the blast, as shrapnel in boiling steam tore through the ship. A second boiler exploded shortly afterwards, with the same result. The wooden vessel immediately caught fire, which spread through the ship with alarming speed. Those on board panicked, and those that threw themselves overboard risked drowning in the rapid current of the frigid, dark waters of the Mississippi. In the words of one Union POW, quote, "When I came to my senses, I found myself surrounded by wreckage and in the midst of smoke and fire. The agonizing shrieks and groans of the injured and dying were heart-rending, and the stench of burning flesh was intolerable and beyond my power of description." End quote. Residents of the nearby town of Marion, Tennessee, those who only weeks earlier supported the Confederate cause, began a hastily assembled rescue operation, sending anything that could float to rescue the stricken passengers, using boats, rafts, and anything else that could be found. Many bodies were never recovered as the Sultana sank to the bottom of the Mississippi. There is some debate as to the number of casualties from the Sultana disaster, ranging from around 1,200 to 1,800. Captain Mason was among the dead. Regardless of the exact number, the Sultana disaster ranks as the worst maritime tragedy in American history. So, did you know that steamboat racing was a common pastime? It wasn't uncommon for boats to race each other. They would overpressure their boilers and explode. Charles Dickens noted that a steamboat would blow up at least once a week, but that didn't stop people from egging on the participants and betting on the outcome. While the Sultana was pretty deadly, this sort of thing was an overall common occurrence along the waterways of the US in the 19th century. These races are still held today, though with a lot more oversight. The Titan II missile disaster, 1980. It comes as no surprise that nuclear warheads are dangerous things, and this can be true even if they don't launch. On September 18, 1980, workmen were conducting routine maintenance on a Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile with a loaded 9-megaton nuclear warhead at Launch Complex 374-7 near the town of Damascus, Arkansas. Around 6:30 p.m., one of the workmen dropped a heavy wrench socket from the platform he was working on. The tool fell roughly 80 feet before striking the missile. The impact tore a hole in the first-stage fuel tank, causing a leak of the highly flammable fuel. When word of the accident spread, the personnel on the base, as well as civilians from the nearby area, were evacuated as damage control teams were assembled. With civilians and non-essential personnel safely away, damage control teams entered the facility, breaking a security fence and the outer security door of the facility to do so. Airmen David Livingston and Jeff Kennedy were able to obtain air samples to determine the level of contamination from the leaked fuel. Their readings maxed out instruments as the leaking rocket fuel permeated the atmosphere. At 3 a.m. on September 19th, the two men ascended back to the surface and just reached the access portal when the gas ignited, causing a massive explosion. The 740-ton door on the silo was blown 200 feet into the air, landing some 600 feet away. The warhead itself was propelled within 100 feet of the facility's main entry gate. Luckily, thanks to proper safety features, the radioactive material was contained. Airman Kennedy was caught in the concussive blast and launched 150 feet away, suffering a broken leg, while Livingston was crushed in a pile of rubble. He would succumb to his injuries after a rescue party discovered him hours later. 21 people in total would be injured in the explosion or in the following rescue efforts. Debris from the explosion was spread in a 400-acre area which took months to clean up, and an estimated 100,000 gallons of contaminated water would have to be pumped from the site. Launch Complex 374-7 was completely destroyed, and estimates to rebuild ran into the tens of millions of dollars. In the end, the Air Force determined that it was not worth the resources to rebuild, and the launch site was filled in with soil and concrete. 6 airmen would be awarded the Airman's Medal for heroism due to their actions and professionalism for their actions, including David Livingston posthumously. A congressional inquiry found that the Titan II program was fundamentally safe and that the incident was an unfortunate accident. This event just goes to show that even the most complex, sophisticated, and well-regulated systems can be destroyed by the simplest of mistakes. Can you imagine it? A multi-million-dollar missile, the height of military technological innovation at the time, destroyed because someone had butterfingers. There wasn't a danger of a nuclear explosion under those conditions, but still, hearing about an accident in a nuclear missile silo must have caused more than a few sleepless nights. It's crazy how quickly things can go wrong. In the military, the stakes are even higher. It just goes to show that even the most carefully made plans can fall apart by accident.